So we were starting on our oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves, and I started to tell you about a shift to the right and shift to the left. And last week I asked you if you were to have a near drowning experience, what type of water would you rather have a near drowning experience in? Cold or warm? And why cold? Because other organ systems are going to shut down. They're exposed to cold temperatures. So is your brain, but your brain is one of the last organ systems to shut down. People frequently talk about their out-of-body experience, reliving their life, talking to people that had passed on before them. Your brain is very active up to the last minute. Just like when you dream, your whole body is shut down for you when you sleep, but your brain is very active. And when you're about to transition, whatever you believe that to be, your brain is very active. It's very active, and you're going through a lot of stuff. You're hashing out stuff that you thought wasn't important is now suddenly important. I mean, a lot of stuff is coming in at you in your brain. So your brain is very active, and if your body temperature is colder, that's going to be a left shift. That's a greedier hemoglobin. It's greedier. It's easy to load. Are you listening to me on this? Really make sure that you can evaluate these curves for unloading and loading, because it's a different story. Let's do unloading. If we're unloading, let's say we're going from 100% to 50. We draw a horizontal line across and then a vertical line down. And we see for a left shifted curve, to get to 50% unloading, 2 molecules of oxygen to come off. I need a bigger pressure gradient, don't I? But we don't take the time to go reverse, and you need to. How much pressure would it take for a greedy hemoglobin to load to 100% or close to it? It's a lot sooner than the other 2 curves. Do you see that? So I would need a lower pressure gradient to get it to become saturated to 100% if that's my perspective. Loading, not unloading. How much would I need to get it to load up? A lot less pressure to load up to hit that sweet mark compared to the other 2 curves. It's the 3-year-old. Do you want a present? Yeah. Getting a toddler to load up with a present does not take a lot of pressure. Turning to someone who is an adult, I thought of you. This White box reminded me of yourself. Please take it. I thought of you. Have it. And she's like, greedy hemoglobin, eager to load up, difficult to unload. I don't want to let it go. Remember, that's Hayden. He would open his gifts, and then I would say, your cousin's coming over. We need to hide them. I don't want to give them up. I don't want to give up. Give me the present, but I don't want to unload. So 2,3-DPG. Back in Unit 1, I told you the 3 different hemoglobins: embryonic, fetal, and adult. Embryonic, alpha 2, epsilon 2, fetal, alpha 2, gamma 2, adult, alpha 2, beta 2. All of them have alpha 2s. And I said to you, embryonic has a higher affinity, and you all said, yep, that makes sense because we're a yolk sac. We need to have oxygen diffuse from maternal blood vessels through the uterine wall into this yolk sac. And then I said, and when it's a fetus, they have their own blood vessels, but they're in countercurrent fashion compared to mom's blood vessels. They're in close proximity, but they're still not mixing blood. And you all said, yep, that makes sense. It still needs a higher affinity. What if I told you, actually, that the fetal hemoglobin has exactly the same affinity as adult in a test tube? In a test tube. That's ex vivo. Science talk, we say that's ex vivo. That's not in vivo, which means in the living tissues. So ex vivo, fetal hemoglobin and adult hemoglobin have exactly the same affinity. But in vivo is a game changer. I'll show you why. Where does 2,3-DPG bind to? Which globin chains? Do you see it in the picture? The beta chains. Okay. What is adult hemoglobin? Alpha 2, beta 2. What's fetal? Alpha 2, gamma 2. So if I'm taking fetal red blood cells and adult red blood cells, and I'm cracking them open, lysing them, and dumping the hemoglobin into a test tube, there is no 2,3-DPG. There is none. I'm taking it ex vivo. 2,3-DPG is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism, which is what the red blood cell has to use. It does not have mitochondria, I'll remind you. So if I crack open these fetal and quote adult red blood cells and put them in a test tube, not exposed to anything else that's going on outside in the red blood cell, they would have exactly the same affinities. And yet, when I look at them in vivo, I see a left shift for the fetal hemoglobin. In vivo, the red blood cells are having to rely on anaerobic metabolism. They are making 2,3-DPG. Other cells that are resorting to anaerobic metabolism, not just making lactic acid, but other kinds of byproducts from anaerobic metabolism. 2,3-DPG, that 2,3-DPG, some textbooks call it 2,3-BPG, diphosphate, bisphosphate, it means two. That byproduct of anaerobic metabolism causes a left shift of the fetal hemoglobin. That means I require less pressure to load up. I require less pressure to load up. This one's already close to 100% saturation before the right shifted adult. Easy to load up. That's the 3-year-old. Difficult to let go. Greedy. I don't want to give up my Christmas present. It would require a greater shift to unload. Less pressure to load, greater shift in pressures to unload. It's the greedy hemoglobin. What about carbon monoxide? I like to think of carbon monoxide, I hate to call it this, but it kind of is. Do you remember my story last week when I said, when I come home at night, where do I bind? Where do I bind? To my honey, of course, to my honey, of course, to my honey. And when the boys were younger and they would see me go and give my honey a big hug, what did the boys do? Ran and launched off the ottoman. WWE. Remember? Well, carbon monoxide is the whore that honey is cheating on me with. And every semester I say this, I have at least one student going, your honey's, I'm gonna go beat him up. That's not right. You're a good person. I'm like, I'm just using an analogy. It's just a story. Honey's not really cheating on me, right? Yeah. Not until the sweet release of death, love, and I can arrange that early. That's going to be public. Anyway. So carbon monoxide is an insidious gas. It is odorless, tasteless, colorless, and people this time of year, they die from it. Do you have a heater that's going? See, it really hasn't gotten cold enough yet for most of us to turn on our heaters. But if your heater is going and you don't hear, you need to have that checked. And Edison will come out and check it for you for free. You just have to make that call. But people who can't afford heat will have, a lot of times, large groups of family members. They share one small apartment for like 10 people because they can't afford rent. They can't afford heat. And they bring in the barbecue. And they light the barbecue. And they all go to sleep that night. And they don't wake up. We read about it all the time, around in February the most, in Los Angeles Times or OC Register. Actually, over the summer, if you were reading the paper, there was a family from Iowa that went to Mexico to vacation, and they didn't wake up. Did you read about them? Family of 4. They were supposed to come home. They did not come home. Family members phoned in to the Mexican government saying, where are they? They entered the condo that they were staying in, and they were all dead. It was carbon monoxide. You do not show signs of dyspnea. You do not show signs of air hunger. You will be pink and fleshy. You will not be cyanotic. If you die from carbon monoxide poisoning, I come rushing in, I find a family of 4 passed out. They actually had to send the first responders back out because when they all came rushing in and saw all 4 of them calmly in their beds, they knew something was amiss in the atmosphere. They sent them back out and they found a gas leak. They found a gas leak. And on the news, on NPR, for example, they were talking about how you could have a detector for cents on the dollar going, and you plug it in and it can detect carbon monoxide leaks. Something so simple could have saved them. And quite frankly, while I was listening to that report, I would not have known to buy that device. I would not have known, but it makes sense. You go into somebody else's home, Airbnb, you might want to make sure that you have a carbon monoxide tester. And you can have one where you plug it in just like you would your phone. I didn't even think of that. In a family of 4, young kids, for something so simple. Tragic. Carbon monoxide is insidious, much more because of it not being, it doesn't have an odor, you can't taste it, you can't see it. It's insidious because it does 2 things to your red blood cells. 2. It binds to my seat. Binds to my honey. That's not okay. And just like every cheating man, they're going to try and get away with keeping their mistress and their honey. Want to know why? Divorce is expensive. So I'm being very sexist. Women cheat too. I'm not saying only men cheat. Women cheat too. I'm just using an analogy. Please. Please, no, I'm just using an analogy. But carbon monoxide binds to the heme group. It occupies a spot. So you can have, listen to me, you can have 210 molecules of molecular oxygen to 1 molecule of carbon monoxide, and it will be a 50-50 brawl onto the heme. That's how much the affinity is for the heme for carbon monoxide. So now, let's say I have 1 carbon monoxide bound to one of my 4 heme groups. I have 75% saturation now, not 100%, 75. And it causes a left shift, which means that cheating heme is going to try and keep all the other 3 molecular oxygen molecules bound. Yes, I can keep my mistress and my wife too. That's basically what it's saying. So now you have reduced oxygen carrying capacity. Carbon monoxide poisoning is similar to what? Yes, anemia. Reduced oxygen carrying capacity. And the remaining oxygen molecules, whatever they might be, 3 out of 4, 2 out of 4, 1 out of 4, they're held more tightly. It's a left shift. So the iron is less likely to let go of the oxygen. What an insidious gas, which is why I call it the whore. Hemoglobin grams percent. We measure that using a hemoglobinometer or the Tallquist test. You all used the Tallquist test. You used a piece of paper. You compared the redness of my blood compared to a swatch of colors. Do you remember that? Then you multiplied that grams percent by 1.34 milliliters of oxygen for every gram of hemoglobin that I had. That then calculated my oxygen carrying capacity. That's not the same as total oxygen content. Last week, I showed you if you want to calculate total oxygen content, you need to add oxygen carrying capacity plus the amount of oxygen dissolved into my plasma. What is that according to Henry's law? Solubility times the pressure gradient. Exactly. And for that, we need to draw arterial blood. That's a totally different blood draw. Have you ever had arterial blood drawn? You would remember it. They take it here, not here, arterial blood. They take it from the radial artery usually. And that's a deeper vessel to go for. You remember where you are. It's more painful than here. So here are 1, 2, 3 different people. You see the dark solid lines with different hemoglobin grams percent. 10, 15, 20. 15 is the normal range. If that hemoglobin is made correctly, if the iron is in the reduced state, the ferrous version, if nothing is wrong with that hemoglobin, then it will load appropriately with oxygen. Notice the percent saturation curves. This one for 20, here's the 100% saturation. 15, here's the 100% saturation. 10, if the hemoglobin is made fine, then there's no reason why it can't load up correctly. Pulse oximeters only tell you if your hemoglobin is loaded up correctly. It does not tell you if your patient is anemic, which is the definition of it, a reduced oxygen carrying capacity. How many times do I have to beat that into your head? So if you had a pulse ox attached to these 3 individuals, if there was nothing wrong with their lungs, if their pressures were just fine, they would all be 100% saturated. They would not tell you if the person was anemic. Only if you do a hemoglobinometer or Tallquist test would you be able to determine if their oxygen carrying capacity was reduced. I guarantee you that's on your final. I guarantee you. How do you calculate oxygen carrying capacity? How do you calculate total oxygen content? I beg you to know the difference. There are different tests you need to ask from the phlebotomist, from the lab tech. And then in this one, what's hemoglobin that has carbon monoxide bound to it? That's called carboxyhemoglobin. Carboxy, and test you on this. It's on your final. I guarantee you, carboxyhemoglobin. And here's a person that has carbon monoxide bound. And you can see the left shift. It's all left shifted, which means the remaining iron centers in the heme groups that have oxygen bound, those iron centers are not in the tensed. They are not in the tensed position. They're in the relaxed. And they want to hold on to oxygen even more. And they will not relinquish that oxygen to the tissues. Okay. So it took me a long time to tell you how we transport oxygen. 2 ways. 2 ways. Dissolved in our plasma according to Henry's law, solubility times pressure, and bound to our iron heme pyrrole groups according to how well we make hemoglobin and how many red blood cells we have and how well filled they are. How do we actually transport CO2? 6 different ways, 6 to 2. 3 occur in the plasma, 3 occur in the cytoplasm. Let's talk about plasma. CO2 can actually bind proteins to their histidine residues, proteins that are in the plasma, like albumin. Albumin is not a new protein to you at this point in the semester. So those are called carbamino compounds. Carbamino. We also can have CO2 dissolved in the plasma according to Henry's law, solubility times pressure. We also can have carbon dioxide hydrated to water naturally on its own, where CO2 with water forms carbonic acid. We know this story already. It dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate, but that reaction does not happen quickly on its own. If I look, I could take a Ziploc baggie, blow CO2, add water, shake it. I would not have a bag full of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate readily. That reaction does not happen readily. It does happen, but not abundantly. What about the other 3 ways in the red blood cell? Okay, well, some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. That forms carbamino hemoglobin. They ask you this on your final. What is hemoglobin with carbon monoxide bound, and what is hemoglobin with carbon dioxide bound? One is carbamino, and one is carboxy hemoglobin, right? Carbamino hemoglobin, carboxy hemoglobin. That should be an easy point for you. Some carbon dioxide is just naturally dissolved in the cytoplasm. Again, according to Henry's law. The great majority of our carbon dioxide that we transport is in the hydrated form, where in the red blood cell we have water and carbon dioxide thanks to carbonic anhydrase forming carbonic acid, dissociating into hydrogen and bicarbonate. And that bicarbonate leaves the red blood cell into the plasma. The great majority of the way we transport carbon dioxide is in the form of bicarbonate in the plasma. Thanks to this reaction, thanks to this enzyme, the bicarbonate shifts out and chloride shifts in. That should be another easy point. Let me do it again. Let me do it again. I can't give up this slide. This slide is back from the days when I first started here, and we did not have that. We did not have YouTube. We did not have podcasts. And I would stand up here and do overhead transparencies. I did. And I had to draw this stuff. I have CO2 leaving the cells. They are metabolically active. CO2 diffuses into the plasma. Let's address that first. CO2 can bind to plasma proteins like albumin, forming carbamino compounds, binding to albumin, for example. It can also just be dissolved, solubilized in the plasma, according to Henry's law. It can spontaneously, but rarely, be hydrated and form carbonic acid, which dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate. The great majority of CO2 will go into the red blood cell. Some of it will bind to the hemoglobin, histidine residues, and form carbaminohemoglobin. Some of it will just stay dissolved, solubilized in the cytoplasm, according to Henry's law. The great majority of it, though, will be hydrated thanks to carbonic anhydrase found in great abundance in the red blood cell, forming carbonic acid, which will dissociate into hydrogen bicarb, and the bicarb goes out into the plasma, and that causes a chloride shift in. And that reaction will reverse in the lungs. Hydrogen that's made binds to hemoglobin. See that down here? Hemoglobin binds more than just oxygen. Hemoglobin transports CO2 and hydrogen. It transports all three. Should be another point. In the lungs, the hydrogen comes off, the CO2 comes off, the hydrogen, the bicarbonate comes back in, chloride leaves. We call that the chloride shift. It's the Haldane effect. We reform carbonic acid, we reform CO2 in water. The CO2 comes out into the plasma, out to the interstitial space, out into the alveolus, and we blow it away. This is a reversible reaction. We transport our carbon dioxide mostly in the plasma as bicarbonate. So let's talk about CO2. Because out of the gases, yes, everyone yawn. Yes, everyone yawn. Out of the gases that we are breathing, we learned last week that we are breathing mostly what gas? Nitrogen. But it is physiologically inert. We don't really use it for anything. And what is its solubility? Very low. It has the highest pressure according to Dalton's law. According to Henry's law, then if we made a prediction, we could argue that more nitrogen should be in our blood. But according to Henry's law, it's not just about pressure, it's about what else? Solubility. And it's not very soluble. So although it is the most abundant gas we are breathing in, not a heck of a lot of it gets into our blood. But is it there? It is there. And the gas with the highest pressure in your blood, in your plasma, is the one saying, I want out, I want out. Remember, it's striking the vessel walls. I want out. I made you all strike the walls of this room and the cold room, remember? Arguably, you could have me fired for that. I abused you. Arguably. I'm trying to get fired. Nobody. So, CO2. Remember, that was the gas that was like, you want me in? You want me out? Where do you want me to go? I'm happy. Wherever you want me to go. It's the happy gas. Turns out, CO2 is the number one gas that regulates your respiration. So let's talk about that. We're all about coming back to Unit 1. It's all about coming back to Unit 1. Unit 1, you started out learning about blood and what's in the blood. Congratulations. After today, we only have 2 more days. After today, I don't have any more instruction. It's kind of sad. Unit 1, you learned about negative and positive feedback. I started with that. In Unit 1, you learned about you learned about a feedback loop. What are the 5 components you need? You learned about it in Unit 1. I beat it into your head in Unit 2. Clearly you've forgotten. Phone a friend, get the brain back. Whoever has your brain right now, you need that back for the next week. 2 weeks. What are the 5 components of a feedback loop? I'll start. Number 1, you have to have a sensor. Number 2, you have to have afferent fibers relaying the information up to the brain. Number 3, you have to have the brain or spinal cord. That's called integration. Number 4, you have to have efferent fibers to communicate an outgoing command. Is any of this ringing a bell? And then 5, you have to have effectors, something in the body that will respond to the brain or spinal cord. That's what you have to have. And your breathing is controlled by this. It's through a reflex arc. That's what you learned in Unit 1 and Unit 2. Reflex arcs. So something has to be able to monitor something in the blood. Which blood gas is being monitored? Is it oxygen or CO2? Both. But which one is the primary? CO2. Does oxygen get monitored? Sure, when you fall asleep at night. But your oxygen has to dip below 60 millimeters of mercury before your brain is like, hey, maybe we should breathe. CO2 is the number 1 gas. So we need a sensor, we need nerves telling the brain, hey, this is what's going on. We need the brain to make some sort of decision. It has to compare and contrast. And then we have an outgoing command, and then we have to have effectors. And our effectors, when we're talking about breathing, is our diaphragm and our external intercostals. Remember, our work of breathing is inhale, inhalation. That's our work of breathing. When we're talking about the integration part, let's start there. Where are we in the brain for integration? The parts of the brain that are actually sending signals out, responding to signals that they're getting in. Okay, we're talking about the medulla oblongata and the pons. Those are the 2. Medulla oblongata is kingpin. There are a lot of nuclei in the medulla oblongata for such a small part of the brain. Nuclei, when we're talking about the brain, is a collection of neurons that have a common function. So I want you to remember DIVE, D-I-V-E. It's a test question. It's a test question. D-I-V-E. Dorsal stands for D. I stands for inspiratory. V stands for ventral. And E stands for expiratory. When you are doing normal, quiet breathing, we all said last week, inspiration is your work of breathing. So the dorsal respiratory group of the medulla oblongata is what controls your normal, quiet breathing. But there's another respiratory group called the ventral respiratory group. And the ventral respiratory group kicks into play when you are doing more forced breathing. You know, when you're sucking wind and you need a faster respiratory rate, like when you're working out. So I remember D-I, dorsal for inspiratory, quiet, normal breathing. What vowel is by D? I. That's the only vowel by the letter D. So quiet, normal inspiration, dorsal respiratory group. What vowels are around V in the word dive? I and E. If I and E, if E expiratory is now becoming active, if I'm actively exhaling, that means my breathing rate and depth has been increased. So ventral respiratory group is all about active inhale and active exhale. Both parts of our ventilation are now active, are now part of our work. We forget that the diaphragm is skeletal muscle. These pictures up here are my pathetic way of trying to remind you that the skeletal muscle of the diaphragm needs to be remembered. It has a somatic motor neuron that innervates it. The phrenic nerve, C2, C3, C4, C3, C4, C5 keeps the diaphragm alive. C3, C4, C5. And if you want a skeletal muscle to contract more, you did a physio X on this. You have to have more firing. We forget our frequency wave summation, which is what my pathetic pictures are trying to show you. You gotta fire more action potentials through the phrenic nerve. You get a maximum force of contraction, you get a maximum inhale, and then you relax that to get an exhale. We forget that from Unit 2. We also forget from Unit 1 and 2 the components of our reflex arcs. We have to have something that monitors this stuff. We have receptors. They're called chemoreceptors. Stuff dissolved in your blood. What stuff? Which gas? CO2 and oxygen. CO2 and oxygen. What about CO2? Carbon dioxide. Where are the receptors for that? Oh, there are two different kinds. There are peripheral and there are central. Peripheral are in the aortic arch and carotid sinus. Oh, what other receptors were there? You forget Unit 3. What other receptors were in the aortic arch and carotid sinus? Yes, say it. Baroreceptors, pressure receptors. Now we have chemoreceptors, and they are exquisitely sensitive to the amount of carbon dioxide. Oxygen, where are those chemoreceptors? Same place, aortic arch, carotid sinus. Peripheral chemoreceptors respond to both. Do you know which one they respond to the most? Oxygen. But oxygen has to get really low, like below 80 millimeters of mercury. And if you're reading those two chapters that I asked you to read, it has to really get low before those receptors respond to oxygen levels being so low that it signals the brain saying, hey, you might want to breathe. Really low. Oxygen receptors don't really drive your ventilation until, it has to get really low. Really low. Small changes in oxygen are not going to trigger you to have changes in your ventilation. Small changes in carbon dioxide will. Carbon dioxide not only has peripheral chemoreceptors, its primary target are the central ones. These are the ones that are in the fourth ventricle, and I'll remind you, because anatomy was a prereq, that's bounded superiorly by the pons, inferiorly by the medulla oblongata. CO2 targets receptors in that fourth ventricle. But it's actually not CO2 directly that does it. It's hydrogen. Hydrogen actually targets the receptors there. So then, Kara, why do you have carbon dioxide as being the primary gas that drives our ventilation? Let me show you the conundrum. Here is the fourth ventricle. We have a blood-brain barrier. The chemoreceptors are in the fourth ventricle. They bind directly to hydrogen. Problem, hydrogen can't get through the blood-brain barrier. It can't. It's an ion. CO2 can get through cell membranes. CO2 can get into the fourth ventricle. And guess what enzyme the fourth ventricle has? Carbonic anhydrase. So here we have our CO2 plus water forming carbonic acid. How many? You should be ready for this by next Tuesday, right? Your lab exam next Tuesday. I know. Were you not informed that next Tuesday is the lab exam? You look shocked. Thursday is lecture 4. This Thursday is lecture 4. Next Tuesday is lab exam 2. And then a week after that is your final exam. Core night class, they have lecture exam 4 this Thursday. Lab exam next Tuesday, and they have their final exam next Thursday. If you want to take your final exam on Thursday, let me know. I'll have it ready for you. Because you all are definitely having different exams. It's not fair. Then you get an extra week. And they don't. So I'm leveling the playing fields. They're both 90 points. It's just a matter of what kind of points. You let me know. 2 days to prep, you let me know. You let me know. You can take it early if you want, get it over with. Sure. Everyone's like, I don't know what to do. I get my Christmas holiday earlier? I don't know. So CO2 can diffuse across biological membranes. It will interact with water thanks to carbonic anhydrase, forming bicarbonate and hydrogen. And then the hydrogen, now that it's in the fourth ventricle, it can stimulate directly the chemoreceptors once it's in the fourth ventricle. CO2 is the primary gas that drives your ventilation. Please pick that one. If oxygen goes from 100 millimeters of mercury down to 90, not going to drive ventilation very well. But if CO2 goes from 45 millimeters of mercury, and I'll remind you, normal values are 35 to 45. If CO2 just went up to 47, 48 millimeters of mercury, your ventilation rate and depth would go up 2 to 3-fold. What would you look like? Whatever you're doing quietly right now for breathing, imagine that going up 2 to 3-fold for just about 3 millimeters of mercury. That's phenomenal. CO2 is the primary gas driving ventilation. Could you change your ventilation rate when your body doesn't need it? Remember, none of you wanted to audition for a porn. None of you did. I asked you, I said, let's all breathe like we're in a porn. And you were like, Little Miss Can't Be Wrong. Little Miss Saint Roselle. That's hyperventilation, right? You're breathing out too much CO2. What happens? That's a loss of acid. What would happen to your blood pH? This is a test question on your final. So if you breathe out too much CO2, what happens to your blood pH? It goes up. I asked a test. I'm giving away the final right now. If you don't breathe enough, hold your breath. I'm not taking the final. CO2 levels are going up in your blood. What's happening to your pH? It's dropping. And you're in acidosis, aren't you? Acidosis, alkalosis, that's on lecture 4. It's on lab 2. And it's on their final. It's that important. All of that, lecture 4, lab 2, and your final. That should be your sweet spot. That should be your happy place out of everything I can test you on. So let me tell you about Undine's curse. That's this beautiful lady here. I wish I had that body. Back in the days when that was celebrated to be like abundant, shall we say. Abundant. Undine's curse. That's a different kind of breathing. So do you want the G-rated version of this mythology or do you want the X-rated?
Just bring it.
Both? I can't do both. You can't undo X-rated. You know that, right? Once you see X-rated, you can't undo that. So Undine's curse. Undine was she was, what do I want to call her? She was a water nymph. And water nymphs, they did not age and they had magical powers. And she made a tragic error. She married a mortal man. And as soon as she married a mortal man, she lost her immortality, but not her magical powers, which her honey should have remembered that. On their wedding day, her honey said, with every waking breath, I pledge my love to you. And she was like, okay. So one day, after they've been married, and she's now starting to age and getting her girth on, as I like to say, she walks by the barn and she hears his familiar snoring. She goes into the barn as if to say, I'm doing all the water. We're doing chores today. What are you doing? And she finds him naked and in the arms of another woman. And she says, on our wedding day, you pledged your every waking breath to me. So be it. You shall have to be awake to breathe. And he pleaded with her. He said, I will die out of boredom, as if to say, if I forget to breathe, I'll die. And she went, sucks to be you. You should have remembered that pledge that you gave me. Most of us don't have to be cognizant of our breathing. We take it for granted. I asked you last week, what is the work of breathing for us? For us, it's the inhalation. But we really don't think about breathing. Could you imagine having a mutation in a gene where you actually have to think about breathing? I don't test you on this. I do not test you on this at all. But we have narrowed it down to a gene where if it's mutated, that child that is born stops, does not breathe. We resuscitate it, stops breathing, we resuscitate it again. If we're lucky enough to capture that child and realize that they're not breathing because they physically have to think about it, 400 people worldwide. That's not a lot on this planet. You can appreciate why it's not a lot. If you can't remember to breathe, you should probably not be alive on this planet, right? If we happen to rescue that infant and keep them alive, they have to be on a ventilator their whole entire life until they're old enough to remember to breathe. Talk to me as a parent. Talk to me as a parent where I remember teaching both my kids, okay, you're now old enough to cross the street on your own, both ways, and another time to the right. Talk to me as a parent who I am now taking my second child driving every day from home. We go driving. He takes his learner's permit exam at the end of this month. Now have that conversation of, are you old enough to remember to breathe? Could you imagine that? And at night, they have to go back on the ventilator. Of course they have to. At night, you're not thinking about breathing, are you? Could you imagine? And then there are people that do have problems with ventilation when they do go to bed. Have you heard of sleep apnea? That apnea is the cessation of breathing. Could you imagine going to sleep and not breathing? And probably, if that's you, it's not you that's even aware of it. It's your bed partner or your neighbor, because you're probably snoring so loud. And when you don't snore anymore, it wakes them up because you're not breathing. It's usually the bed partner or the neighbor next to you that's saying, you've got a sleep problem. That snoring is an issue. What about Shane Stoke breathing? Let me show you what that looks like. You can look it up on Google. You can look up people who are dying and they have Shane Stoke breathing. They will have a big black bar over their face to hide their identity. It's horrible to watch, and it looks a lot like this. Can you hear that asthma?
Oh my. Oh. Hey.
We have a lot to do, so I won't keep doing that. It might not be that dramatic, that loud, but that gasping, you can look it up on Google, look it up, Shane Stokes breathing. You won't necessarily hear the air like I did, but you will see them ventilating like that, and then no more. And it gets to a point where they're ventilating so much, and then they don't. We call it positive gain breathing. And then they ventilate even more. And it's because their brain is going, wait, which gas am I monitoring? Is it oxygen now or CO2? And wait, okay, so if it's oxygen, and then they get so much oxygen in and they ventilate out so much CO2 that their brain goes, whoa, what was I thinking? That was too much. So don't breathe out. And then the periods where they're not breathing start getting longer and longer until no more. So pure oxygen. We don't really give pure oxygen. But my point is, if our main gas that drives ventilation is CO2, if somebody has a respiratory issue, we recognize from weeks worth of lecturing that CO2 levels, if a person becomes hypercapnic from respiratory acidosis, CO2 is no longer the gas that drives ventilation. Under abnormal conditions, CO2 fails to be the primary gas. And I told you that last week when I told you about Dave Shaw and Dion Dreyer. CO2 under pressure, underwater, no longer drives your ventilation. Above water, if someone is hypercapnic, CO2 stops to be the main gas. The person has hypercapnia. According to Dalton's law, if I have more CO2, then that's more CO2 striking. Remember, that's the gas, like, you want me in? I'll go in. I'll go in. See what happens going in? I have more strikes to push me in, I'll go in. And according to Dalton's law, if I have more trapped dirty air, more functional residual capacity, then I don't have as much oxygen. And oxygen isn't the gas that's the most soluble. So if I release the pressure in the alveolus, I don't get as much driving force to push that oxygen into my plasma. That's a problem. Okay, so then if CO2 is no longer my primary gas, and I have a patient with respiratory acidosis, they need oxygen, don't they? I give them an oxygen tank. But if I give them too much oxygen, remember, that's now the gas that's driving them to breathe. So the very thing they need, if I give them too much, they won't breathe it. Does that make sense? You're taking away their drive to breathe, is what they say clinically. You're taking away their drive. And as an EMT, if you're trained as an EMT, like one of the first things I tell you, like, hook them up with an oxygen tank, put the little, nasal tubes in. You bring them to the emergency room, and a nurse, am I wrong? What will the doctor and nurse say?
Take it out so we can get a baseline.
Not only that, because you're taking away their drive to breathe. If they have a respiratory issue and you're pushing the oxygen and you're not regulating that, the very thing that they do need, now their brain is like, oh, we've got so much of it, we don't need to breathe. And that's the ventilation part that you need. So they will scream at you. Don't they scream at you? You bring a patient in. No? Well, they don't scream because that's not professional, but they're like, what are you doing? So the very thing they do need, you can't give them too much of. My Aunt Peony, Lavon, that was her name, but that was her nickname, Peony, my Aunt Peony. She died a year ago this month. After her youngest boy, my cousin Rick, died. Super sad. It was a bad last year for that family. And I remember at my cousin Rick's funeral, we were all at the hotel. My Aunt Peony, she had COPD. She was a smoker all her life. And she had her oxygen tank. And we brought her back to the hotel. I was laying down next to my Aunt Peony, and I was like, I'm sorry that we lost your boy. I remember all those vacations we took together. I'm really sorry. She couldn't even talk because she was struggling to breathe. So my mom came over to the other side of her because I'm snuggling up to her in bed. I'm so sorry, Aunt Peony, I can't imagine burying a child. I can't. We're not supposed to do it in that order. It's supposed to be the parents and then the children, not the babies. So I'm snuggling up to her, and my mom is kissing her on her forehead. She starts doing this. She's hitting me, and I'm like, what's wrong, Aunt Petey? What's wrong? My mom was stepping on her oxygen. So she's like, oh, Aunt Petey. Super funny. Not really. It was not really funny, but leave it to the Hyde family to kill off another family relative. But you can't. I mean, the very thing that people need that have respiratory disorders, whether it be respiratory acidosis or whether it be COPD or restrictive disorders, the very thing they need is oxygen, and you have to limit how much they get because CO2 no longer becomes the gas that drives their ventilation. Oxygen does, and it has to dip to pretty low levels before the brain goes, oh, maybe I should tell the diaphragm to contract and we should ventilate more. Are there other components to drive our ventilation? Sure, hold your breath. Now try out for a porn. See, no one plays nicely with that. No one does. So you have voluntary control. Your body temperature also plays a role in how deeply and fast you breathe. Stretch, breathe in. Keep going. Why are you stopping? Did it hurt?
Yeah.
Did it hurt? There are stretch receptors. Your lungs are like balloons. You inflate them too much, they will pop. That's called the Herring-Brewer reflex. Irritant receptors. Okay, if we were living up north in paradise, sadly, deadliest fire in our state's history, breathing all that air, all of that particulate matter, the soot getting into your lungs, even if you're wearing a mask, it will still get in there. They were like breathing, it was like breathing sand. Even at Berkeley, miles away, they canceled classes because they didn't want kids bicycling or walking to class. It was soot. breathing down. Those are irritant receptors. They're also going to change your ventilation rate and depth. They're going to cause bronchial constriction, as if to say, don't breathe any more of this stuff in, and it's going to cause a coughing reflex where you're exhaling even more, trying to get that irritant out. And then, of course, anesthesia will alter your breathing rate and depth. And that, my loves, is my last lecture.